Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. C'est un grand plaisir pour moi d'être ici aujourd'hui. Enfin, c'est la seconde fois que je suis à Deauville. La première fois, j'étais ici quand j'ai eu 14 ans pour un échange scolaire. Malheureusement, je n'ai pas eu beaucoup d'opportunités de parler français dans les derniers 20 ans. Et comme ça, je suis désolé, mais il faut que je continue en anglais. When Brigitte asked me to talk about risk management in a transforming world, I was very excited, as over the last 15 years, with most of my clients, those were the discussions we had and those were the work we were doing. And in fact, this is also what we basically do in Oliver Wyman as a company in the broader Marsh & McLennan context. We basically work at the interface of strategy, risk, and people. And I think these three elements are coming together increasingly. Today, I want to briefly speak to you about what are the drivers of transformational requirements and change? What is actually, why are we talking so much about transformation today and about risks compared to maybe 10, 15 years ago? I think secondly, I want to talk to you specifically about a case study, how the energy sector, who has gone through massive transformation, how companies were dealing there with the risks they faced, and how they were running through the transformation, and especially what role risk management did play during that transformation and after the transformation. And then last but not least, from our perspective, what risk managers actually should do differently going forward, where there are areas where risk management can position themselves. And I think at the end, we will definitely have some time for questions. So the change we're experiencing is driving the transformation need and speeds up the transformation cycles. We experience transformation at a pace we could not have imagined 5 to 10 years ago. We think about a few specific disruptions. So national or nationalistic movements in politics. Think about what's happening in the US, Brexit, Italy, Russia, China. We see all developments that basically are changing the environment in which we're basically operating. Secondly, geopolitical change. Alliances are changing, existing systems are changing, treaties are renegotiated. Think of NAFTA, think of the world trade disputes we're currently having. We're having technology development, we're having very fast technology cycle, artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, but also even more important, I think, just the change in agility and the views of the young generation in terms of how they actually look at technology and how they do work in technology. And last but not least, that all is driving a lot change in terms of customer centricity. So everything we do in whatever business we are today is all focused on the customer. How can we be close to the consumer? How can we make sure that we basically deliver what the consumer wants? Because otherwise, the consumer will directly move somewhere else. The need for the constant change and transformation is omnipresent, and organizations need to respond to this. And we also believe that risk management has to play a strong role in supporting that change. Oliver Wyman, we do for 14 years with the World Economic Forum a yearly work on the Global Risk Report, which you might have seen before, and there's kind of a small picture up here. And it's quite interesting to see how the risks have changed over the years. So whilst like 5, 10 years ago, there was a lot about business-specific risks, industry-specific risk, something about financial risks and so on, we've seen over the last years actually 2, 3 areas emerging, which is quite interesting, but also quite a significant change to the nature of risk we're facing. You see up there in the upper left corner, the risks number 1, all around weather, climate change, and how basically that is kind of having an impact on industry. And this is basically based on a lot of workshops and interviews and questionnaires with industry participants. Then secondly, you basically see, you see risks around, societal risks like water crisis, migration, and so on. And thirdly, you see man-made risks driven by technology linked to kind of cyber risks, data fraud, and so on. Now, when you think about all these type of risks and how they kind of evolving from more towards an exogenous nature, there's a very strong impact in kind of the lives and the businesses we're operating in. In consequence to this, we will have to constantly adapt and basically be prepared for the next big risk. And the next big risk might not be an event risk, like a big weather risk or a big, any kind of terrorism attack. The next big risk might be some change in the nature of how our business is evolving. And therefore, it has a much severe impact on the business models of companies than just being able to basically transfer the risk. We believe that risk management can play a major role, and we've seen this in the past years in a lot of our clients in terms of navigating that journey, in terms of creating the awareness. Because whilst there are limits to active control of a lot of these risks, there's the power in anticipation and preparation to these risks. And that is where risk management plays in. Now, talking about a few industries, and you think about how significantly they are impacted. Think of the automotive sector. First, there was the whole conversation around mobility, around electrification. Now there's the diesel discussion coming in. And last but not least, there's the whole disinterest of young people in cars in general, which is very different to at least my generation. My godson is 22 years old now. He doesn't even have a driver's license. He tells me, I don't need it. What would I need it for? He's more focused on his phone and on his friends than on driving a car. I mean, when I was 17, I had a driver's license, but I could only use it when I was 18. It was the most important thing then. It's no more today. So that's changing that industry. Think of the retail sector. I mean, online shopping is omnipresent. Customization of online shopping, even more present now. And what's the result? It's deserting cities. Even shopping malls are getting increasingly empty. And then the oil sector. Until recently, we spoke about peak oil. Today, it's all about peak demand in oil, because we know we have more oil than we will ever need. The energy transition is fully ongoing. Companies are moving from oil to gas to power. I mean, think about Total, think about their major investments into the power and gas sector, all the way down to delivering power and gas to end consumers. So those are major business model changes. And interestingly, these have then a significant impact also on geopolitics, because a lot of the oil-producing nations are getting nervous around their role in the world and their influence in the world, because they understand that the question is no more so much about where to get the oil from, but rather what to do with it. Now, let's look at the utilities sector. I like the utilities sector because I think it went through such fundamental disruption and transformation over the last kind of 10 years. I remember in 2007, we were actually working for one of the largest European utilities on a renewable strategy. And we remember when we did bring the results to the board, the head of production would almost wanted to throw us out of the room, because we were suggesting they should build windmills in the North and the East Sea. Whilst he was saying, why would I do that? I can always put another nuke, or I can always put another coal-fired power plant somewhere, and basically that's going to be much easier for me. But luckily, the CEO was more visionary, and they basically embarked on this, which basically saves all these companies. Because what happened after 2007? We had a massive investment into renewables. We had, in addition to this, we had a lot of severe climate events, which actually changed kind of the view of the world in terms of CO2 emissions. And in addition to this, we had Fukushima, and suddenly nuclear power was no more in fashion. Significant changes. And in addition to this now, with digitization, not only the margin goes downstream, but through digitization, suddenly very new players come into this field. We're not only talking of Google and Amazon, we're talking of like small startup companies based on technology that are just taking the customers from these incumbent utilities. So their whole business model from front to back is basically going through a complete transformation. And when you look at kind of a few examples, I mean, though companies like RWE, E.ON, GDF Suez, they were all kind of very integrated, very powerful, and very valuable power companies or utilities in their own mind. They all transformed completely. RWE became a producer, spinning off all their retail and renewables business, merging it with E.ON. Then you got E.ON splitting off their production business from their retail business. And then you got GDF Suez transforming to Engie, today being kind of the major global lower carbon power company. So amazing change in these industries. And we believe that, you know, when you look at how risk management actually played a role there, it's quite interesting, because the utility sectors be always at the forefront of enterprise risk management, of risk management capabilities. And a lot of good activities helped the transformation, but also some companies failed in anticipating the change. And I think it's interesting to ask this question: where does this come from? So when you look at this slide, you know, we're thinking about what did risk management do before the transformation, during the transformation, and post the transformation. A lot of the utilities, or most of the European utilities, basically had very strong risk quantification linked to their short-term and mid-term planning. They had exposure mapping, they had risk appetite conversations, and therefore they could understand the impact of disruptions. But a lot of the change was only seen too late in these companies. And why was that? Primarily driven by the fact there was a lot of risk reporting ongoing, but top management would not necessarily involve risk enough in a lot of the strategic decision-making, portfolio decisions, and early warning discussions. You look into this phase during the transformation. During the transformation, these companies were in severe financial distress. So what was the focus of risk management during that time? It was basically two areas. One area was really kind of support managing the volatility around meeting refinancing covenants, to not lose investment grade ratings, to not lose financing capability. But secondly, also risk management helped a lot to basically monitoring the risks of the transformation itself. Specifically because a lot of these companies went into new business segments which they were not aware of before. So the risk profile of these companies did change quite a bit. And then post the transformation now, with the recovery in prices, utilities suddenly have funds again which they have to reinvest. So there's a whole debate around what's the portfolio, how should these businesses look like? And therefore there's an increasing focus now on understanding what is the risk-return profile of existing businesses and what will be the risk-return profile of new businesses that will be added. And there's significant decision going on, like should you stay only in upstream, or should you in generation, or should you basically keep downstream or build up downstream, what kind of international expansion you do, all driving different type of risks. So what does that tell us for the role of risk management in a transformational context? I think specifically when you look at kind of the different phases, there's very distinct roles that risk management can play and has to play. But I also believe from my own experience and from discussing and working with our clients, there is changes that also risk management communities in organizations have to do in order to also drive more interlinkage with the top management on the strategic decision making. So we believe that specifically before the transformation, the close integration with the strategy processes and the dialogue around strategy and risk is increasingly important. Embedding risk into the business planning and the technology strategy, and helping basically to focus on developing revenue-generating risk solutions. By the way, interestingly, a study we recently did is that 4/5, so 80% of risk professionals see their views very well shared across the organization on risk, and larger 60% of organizations also already leverage cross-functional committees on risk strategy and finance. Which basically is it's a good kind of element to then think about kind of also about any kind of changes in the business model and M&A transactions and adding to kind of the businesses where we believe even more important risk management has to play a role, because in the past, a lot of the risks that have been acquired were basically not necessarily seen very well. You think about during the transformation, as discussed during the utility case study, any transformation, like any large project, bears a lot of risk in the process itself, and somebody needs to monitor these risks. There's not only risk about processes, about business performance, finance, there's also risk about people, for instance. Increasingly important, people are no more following kind of the changes that are happening, therefore kind of supporting a very proper perspective on how the change is perceived in the organization, and supporting that change by proactive communication and transparent communication is very important. And post the transformation, new capabilities come with the risks, and the risk management has to basically embark on those. And these new capabilities, you know, for instance, you take an example like anything around digital and cyber risk that comes with this, is actually something that risk management needs to build into the capability set of the risk management and the risk departments. And last but not least, I mentioned it before, most importantly, we believe the risk dialogue at the top of the house is extremely important and needs to be fostered. So how do we build this into our daily risk management capability, and what are areas where risk managers can actually change their activity set? I think first of all, in the activities we do, there is basically a requirement to a much higher degree of agility that we see. So it is not about necessarily reporting on a quarterly basis or even on a monthly basis around risk. It's about moving into dynamic relationship with senior management and the business heads to actually make risk not a risk report, but make risk basically a volatility discussion around business objectives. For instance, rather than focusing a risk committee meeting on what are the top risks, the discussion around very specific strategic risks and what can be done about this, be it kind of technology, innovation, you name it, I think might be more efficient. I think secondly, the mindset has to change. I think there's still people that are very much focused in risk on talking about risk, talking about volatility of risk, talking about nice models around risk, and then about risk transfer. But we believe what has to happen is this business sense has to be strengthened. For a risk manager, everything is about understanding the business, understanding what's changing, because by that, the risk manager will become a proper discussion partner for any kind of business manager, and it's no more about basically pushing risk information towards the business manager. The business manager will pull that information from risk management, and that is kind of driving a very constant exchange and will improve significantly the performance of the business. And then also, we believe it's quite important to change a few areas around the capability set. Data, include a lot of data. There's a lot of data around, but one always has to remain very critical around the data we're using, because we can easily kind of put ourselves into self-fulfilling prophecies there. Using new way of analytics, you know, analyzing possible impacts of complex risks through data science. I mean, increasingly you will see across the board in all companies, there's increasingly usage of artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, and these capabilities are being built up, and these capabilities can be also applied in risk management. And then one area where I believe which is most important is really thinking long term, because in most businesses, what we have is we have a short-term budget discussion for a year, and everything is about meeting the budget and what are the risks to that. Then there's like a 3 years discussion, which is more like, well, 5 years around financial planning, and maybe even a 10 years discussion about where are our investments going. But think about climate change risk. 10 years ago, everybody said, yeah, climate change is a big thing. We don't know exactly what it is, and it's going to be there maybe long term, but certainly after my term. Today, climate change is just here. We got weather events. We got actually, you know, again, coming back to the utility sector, there's not enough water in the rivers in summer because it's dry. So it's hitting. I mean, I'm Swiss. I'm from Zurich. We had a water shortage this year, the first time in our history in Switzerland, which is kind of weird. But I mean, those things are happening, and they are impacting businesses as we speak. So that's something I think, thinking about the long-term risks now and kind of being able to transport that message that it's actually going to impact your business in 3 to 5 years, and you have to act or think today about what it means. That's one of the most important areas we believe going forward. So in summary, I think there is 2 areas of change and 2 areas of focus that we're currently seeing and that will basically develop over the next years even more. I think risk management itself has to change. So back to the point around fostering a debate with top management about how risk is impacting business will be critically important. Secondly, building the capabilities around proving the point on why that risk is important and what is the nature behind it. And we all know what you can't measure, you can't manage. So we need to put proper numbers behind it, and we need to decompose the risks into different scenarios. And thirdly, again, we need to proactively involve risk into all decision-making processes on the strategic level, on operational level, because then risk management becomes a significant part of the business today, and it's not an adjacent activity. But also top management needs to change, whether this is the board, whether this is the CEO, whether it's the CFO. And we're seeing actually increasingly good signs of this because there's increasingly scrutiny from investors on board representatives, non-executive board members, around basically making them personally liable for risks that have not been managed. So from there, we see increasingly pressure from the board on the executive teams and the CEOs, as they are personally very vulnerable to any kind of risks not being managed these days, are becoming increasingly receptive for that debate. Therefore, top management has to change, and has to change in a way that, as said before, that long-term risks can very quickly have a significant short-term impact and be disruptive to the business and not only be basically a little kind of change to performance. Secondly, I think there is an appropriate resourcing required, which means not only human resourcing and models and technology, it's also basically making sure the link between the capabilities of risk, finance, strategy are merging together. And last but not least, we very strongly believe that risk management has to sit on the table for any type of strategic discussions, talking about proper CRO roles, because in the end, that will basically foster the debate, and that will ultimately bring the benefit by combining strategic risk and any kind of HR discussions linked to technology. So thank you very much. I stop at this point in time. We might have a few minutes for discussion, and again, apologize my bad French. Thank you.
Merci. Merci beaucoup, Roland Rechtsteiner. S'il y a quelques questions, effectivement, on peut les prendre maintenant. Vous avez effectivement dressé le portrait de ce que doit être le risk manager de demain. Juste une question. Just one question. Quel est le plus grand risque, à votre avis, en tout cas le plus urgent qu'il va falloir traiter?
So if I understood your question correctly, you were asking me what I think is the biggest risk that has to be managed going forward. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay, my French is not that bad then. Okay. so basically, from my perspective, honestly, when you think at specific risks, I think everything around climate risk and around how that is impacting our lives, our businesses, that's from my perspective like the biggest risk we're seeing. But from a corporate perspective, I believe the risk of neglecting some changes that are out there and not thinking early enough about how to implement those today, from my perspective, is the biggest risk for businesses.
Merci. Merci beaucoup. Vous pouvez l'applaudir. Merci Roland Rechtsteiner d'avoir ouvert ce débat.